You're listening to In Bed with Science, a sex podcast. I'm Lee Noren, a sex therapist with a Master of Science in Sexology and over 12 years of coaching, counseling, and therapy experience. Today, I'm answering a listener question about casual sex, mixed signals, and the kind of tension that comes with playful power dynamics. Specifically, what happens when you enjoy tease and control or initiating sex, even as a submissive, but your partner doesn't seem to respond the way you expected them to? We'll talk about how to communicate those dynamics more clearly, why even light BDSM needs consent and conversation, and how to figure out if you're sexually aligned before someone checks out without explanation. But first, do you have a sex or relationship question you want to ask, but you're not quite sure where to turn? Now's your chance. I'm looking for thoughtful, personal questions about things like intimacy, mismatched libidos, emotional disconnect, and struggles with sexual pleasure and desire. Specifically, those messy, non-Hollywood experiences that we all have but rarely talk about. And I'll be answering them in upcoming episodes of the podcast with both compassion and scientific insight. Submit your story or question anonymously, or with your name if you'd like, and it might be featured in a future episode. Okay, now on to the question. Today's question is from a woman who is seeing a guy casually, and they both like to play with power dynamics. However, a miscommunication occurred, ending the fling, and now the listener wants to know how to avoid this kind of miscommunication in the future. Here's the listener question read by an AI voice.
I just had sex twice with a man I was seeing casually. My first time at his place. As I was about to leave, I suggested a quickie. He said he needed to work and would need a nap if we had sex again, and then started walking me out. At the door, I kissed him, pressed him against the wall, and he changed his mind. We ended up back in bed for round 3. Afterwards, though, he was distant, slow to confirm plans, and canceled 2 more dates for me to come to his house, ultimately saying that the relationship was going in a different direction than he wanted. We had continued to sext back and forth before he ended our relationship, and I think he was turned off by my resistance to his dominant persona. I think the combination of me initiating sex and playfully resisting his control over our interactions ultimately led to the breakup. I honestly was more upset about the loss of orgasms than anything else. But I'm left wondering, should I have asked him how he felt about me initiating or resisting control? I do like being submissive, but also enjoy some back and forth to build tension, to make him work for the prize of my body. How do I communicate these needs with a future sexual partner?
So within this question, there's a lot happening just beneath the surface. So at first glance, it might seem like a simple case of a casual fling that's kind of fizzled out. But when we take a closer look, what we're really seeing here is a disconnect around sexual communication, unspoken expectations, and how power dynamics play out. There's also a question here about sexual compatibility and how we talk about what we want, especially when those wants include a bit of tension, push-pull, or that kind of power play. And the listener wonders, did I do something wrong by initiating, by not fitting into his version of dominance? And those questions are important because what's really coming through here, I think, is a lack of clarity. There's a lack of clarity about roles and desires and about what each person actually wanted from the interaction. And that kind of ambiguity is common, especially in newer or more casual dynamics, and even when it's about more vanilla sex dynamics too. And it can leave both people kind of walking away from the situation, confused, and sometimes hurt. So to help us answer the listeners' questions today, we're going to be using a study from Sexuality Culture by Hamm et al. Called Sometimes It's Easier to Type Things Than to Say Them, Technology in BDSM Sexual Partner Communication. Now, before we get into the findings, let's just break down what BDSM stands for, right? So BDSM is an umbrella term that stands for bondage and discipline, dominance and submission, and sadism and masochism. Today's study explored how people who practice BDSM use technology like texting, chat apps, and websites to have conversations about consent, boundaries, and power dynamics with their sexual partners. Now, important to note about this study is that it wasn't a survey, it was a qualitative study, which means it was based on in-depth interviews. So what I'm sharing are patterns that emerged from people's own words. And here's what they found. Digital tools make it easier to talk about power, desire, and limits. So especially in new or casual dynamics, people found that typing allowed for more clarity and comfort than face-to-face conversations. As one participant stated, sometimes there are things I just cannot bring myself to say out loud, embarrassment or shame or whatever, but I can text and message these things. They also found that texting helps people communicate what they want without killing the mood. So participants said that tech-based conversations made it easier to express sensitive or vulnerable things like what kind of dominance or submission they enjoy without it feeling confrontational or awkward. They also found that early communication, especially online, leads to better sexual experiences. So participants said that these tech-based conversations helped clarify expectations and reduce misunderstandings, especially early on, which in turn supported better experiences overall. They also found that it's not just about safety, it's about confidence. So people said that having the space to think and write their desires down made them feel more empowered. It gave them a chance to name what they like and ask questions and feel more in control of how they showed up sexually. They also found that aftercare happens online too. So texting wasn't just used before sex. Many participants also used tech afterwards to check in emotionally, debrief that experience, and offer support. Especially in casual or long-distance dynamics, these kinds of texts can become a kind of emotional aftercare. And we're going to be getting into more specifics of what aftercare entails further on in the episode. So what does this mean for the rest of us? So if you've ever felt like talking about sex or kink face-to-face is intimidating, you're not alone. According to this study, starting the conversation through a screen isn't avoiding intimacy, it might actually build it. So typing your needs, desires, or questions isn't less valid, it really just is a tool. And in many BDSM dynamics, it's one of the most trusted ones that the community has. And finally, texting builds trust before clothes come off. So participants described how negotiating power dynamics, limits, and desires via text gave them more time to reflect and express themselves clearly and feel emotionally safe. And they felt that this contributed to more ease and connection during sex, which is what we all want more of, right? So in today's Q&A episode, we're talking about kinky sex, and I want to preface this episode by saying that all the things I'm going to be discussing are always only okay within the context of consent. So anything else that isn't explicitly discussed or okayed is not okay and is not BDSM. Now, in this question, the listener didn't specifically mention BDSM or identifying as kinky. However, I would argue that whenever we start to incorporate some kind of power dynamics, we are veering into that BDSM territory. So I will in my answer be talking a bit about BDSM. Okay, so let's start off by unpacking what might have happened here and what to think about moving forward. So first off, it makes complete sense that this whole situation left you feeling unsure, right? 1 minute you're connecting physically and the next he's pulling away and eventually ending things. And that kind of emotional whiplash, especially when sex was still happening and sexting was ongoing, that can leave anyone wondering what they missed. And this may have been a case of mismatched expectations or him misunderstanding the dynamic that you were initiating, not that you were doing something wrong. I want to be really clear about that. Now, within your question, you said that maybe the combination of you initiating sex and kind of playfully resisting his control over your interactions ultimately led to the breakup. And to me, it sounds like there might be an underlying question here of whether it was possibly sort of quote unquote too much to initiate or to resist his control. So let's be clear, it's not too much. And let's talk a bit about different submission styles and where your desires might fit. So submission isn't one size fits all. You can absolutely be a submissive and still initiate sex or enjoy resisting or even want to make someone work for your surrender. So that kind of tension where you sort of tease that control before giving it up is totally valid, and it's even a celebrated dynamic in many dominant submissive relationships, or DS relationships as they're sometimes referred to. So when it comes to being submissive during sex, there are lots of different types. So just to give you a few, there are those who identify as slaves and they crave that kind of deep, ongoing surrender, sort of 24/7 style. There are masochists who get off on receiving pain. There are pleasure subs who love being used for their partner's pleasure. And there are brats who playfully provoke or resist dominance, often seeking that moment of being sort of tamed by their partners. Likewise, dominants vary too, right? So there are service tops or pleasure doms who prioritize the sub's experience. There are sadists who enjoy inflicting consensual pain. And there are tamers who kind of thrive on that power play through wit or cleverness and control. And they're often matched with brats, if you will. And what it sounds like you want more of here, or wanted more of here, is that possibility for a bit of that brat versus tamer dynamic where you can sort of playfully initiate and there can be a give and take of that power and submission. Now, being a brat doesn't mean you want to dominate. It just means you enjoy challenging control within your submission, right? So it's really playful and it's not about taking over. Whereas if we're looking at someone who identifies as a switch, they enjoy switching roles entirely, right? Maybe it's sometimes being dominant and sometimes being submissive, depending on the partner, but also depending on the situation. And this distinction matters because from what you described, it doesn't necessarily sound to me like you want to be in charge. It's just that you enjoy building that tension and making someone earn their dominance a little before you give in. That said, it's one thing to understand the dynamic that you enjoy in fantasy, but translating that dynamic into a new or a casual sexual relationship, it can feel really tricky. And it can be tricky, as we've seen here in the situation you've described. So the question then becomes, how do you talk about what kind of play you want in a way that turns you and your sex partner on and not off? So you don't want to over-explain or kill the vibe, but you also don't want to rely on assumptions. And that's why even small comments like, I like a bit of a chase, or I love when someone takes control after I push them a little. They can be sort of sexy and clear ways of signaling what kind of power play you're into and want. And today's study shows that just because you're typing it, it doesn't mean it's less intimate or sexy. Using tech to express your desires or set the tone for sex can really build that connection. It doesn't diminish it. And the participants in the study said that it helped them express things that deepened their connection, especially when saying them out loud felt a bit too vulnerable. And I don't know about you, but maybe it did for you too. Now, when doing this, you don't necessarily need to define your style too rigidly, but sometimes having some kind of language around what turns you on, especially if you're with a partner who's already kink aware, can make things really a lot clearer. Now, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't iron out specifics, right? Part of how to ensure that BDSM is safe when you practice it is having those very clear discussions around limits and boundaries and safe words. So if you're looking for that play and that give and take of power, that's absolutely something that I'm sure you could find in a future sex partner and communicate about beforehand. Now, this is a topic of discussion that you don't just have to have via text. You can talk about it face to face too, of course. But given the fact that you'd already been sexting, there was this kind of window to talk about it that was already open. So you might be looking at having a conversation via text where you say something like, hey, just so you know, I love resisting a little. It's part of the fun for me. Does that work for you? Right? Kind of bringing that question back to them, not just stating what you want, but checking, is that something you would like to do too? But you could also have it play out some of that push and pull within the sexting itself, right? So saying something cheeky like, I might let you take control if you earn it, or, oh, were you trying to be in charge? That's cute, right? So really kind of leaning into that brat dynamic there. And using tech in this way really is a great way of making sure that you both have the same expectations when you actually have sex with each other. And it's also a great way of creating intimacy. It's a great way to flirt and explore and really clarify the kind of dynamics that excite you so that they know what you want and you know what they want and you're on the same page. Because at the end of the day, that's what we want. We want you to find a partner where you can both explore your fantasies together and being really clear, being crystal clear about the roles that you enjoy and what the power dynamics look like that you want to experience is how you're going to get there. So let's talk a bit about how to find that better compatibility next time. You asked me how you can perhaps better screen or sync with someone in the future who might have a different idea of dominance and submission than you. And the answer to that question, I'm sure you can already guess by now, but it really is to have those open conversations and put your desire into words. So I think the earlier that you can be open, the better it's going to be. And the thing about BDSM is that, if you're with an experienced partner, or you're at least with someone who's been practicing being dominant or a top for a while, they will be, or at least should be, used to having these conversations. They're a necessary requirement if you're doing things responsibly. Now, sometimes what you'll find in these conversations is that there are very clear preferences and there's not a willingness, possibly on the dominant's part, to veer off into another role. But other times you'll find that there is a willingness to venture out. But the way that you're going to get there is through having that conversation. And maybe because your desires weren't possibly stated explicitly, right? You didn't talk about that push-pull dynamic that you wanted. Maybe he didn't know what it meant when you tried to kind of initiate sex in that way, or didn't understand that game that you were trying to play. And so he got confused, or he assumed that you didn't want something that you did want. So again, it comes down to communication. And it's possible that in this situation, the two of you had very different expectations or interpretations of what was happening. So you may have seen your resistance as playful and sexy, but he might have misunderstood it or seen it as disinterest, or maybe even felt like his version of dominance wasn't being accepted by you. And to be clear, that's not a failure on really either of your parts. It's just a sign that more clarity was needed. And the study really backs this up, right? So people said that when they didn't clarify roles beforehand, mismatched interpretations were common. So one partner might think it's playful resistance, and the other might read it as disapproval or a power grab. It also sounds like there was some kind of subtle communication on his part about maybe not being up for sex that third time. So you mentioned he said that he'd need a nap if you had sex again. And maybe this was his way of subtly letting you down. But then when you initiated, it sounds like he kind of changed his mind and he became engaged. So I do wonder if maybe that moment felt a bit ambiguous for both of you, like you were kind of reading different signals, or maybe he wasn't fully clear on what he wanted either, therefore it became really hard for you to read him. Or maybe him needing a nap was him trying to state his dominance again and show that he's the one in control here, or at least he wants to be. And that signal got misinterpreted or misread because it wasn't clear. I think overall, it just sounds like there were quite a few things that were left unsaid. And with sex and relationships in general, it makes it so much easier when we say those quiet parts out loud. So even if it feels awkward in the moment, especially in a casual sexual relationship where we're still getting to know one another and we're reading one another's nonverbal cues, we really need to have those conversations about signals and what they mean. And if we're going to engage in BDSM, again, it really is a non-negotiable. But perhaps it wasn't only what went down at his apartment that influenced the breakup of your fling. So I wonder if part of where things went wrong too is that kind of lack of aftercare that might have occurred. And so for everyone listening, if you don't know, aftercare is that emotional and physical care that's given after a sexual experience, especially in BDSM, where it kind of helps both partners come down from the intensity. Now, this can include things like cuddling or affirming words, can be tending to any physical needs, or simply just checking in emotionally. And the goal is to create safety and connection and closure after vulnerable or intense play. Aftercare can even be sort of likened to a debrief, and even if your question doesn't actually specify that you needed it here, I wonder if maybe he did. Like maybe he needed a chance to process what it was like when you resisted control from him. And the study we're talking about today, it showed how people use texting for aftercare to offer that reassurance and those emotional check-ins, even just to say something like, that was hard and I'm thinking of you. So I'm wondering whether that kind of aftercare there could have been helpful for him, but then also an extension for you and for both of you together to kind of just break down what happened there and how it felt for both of you. So, how do you in the future talk about the kind of submission you're interested in and gauge whether a future partner would like to be dominant? We've talked about it, but let's get really clear on the step-by-step. So first off, I think getting really clear on what you like and possibly reading up a bit could be important, because the more you can name what you want specifically, the more you'll be able to assess whether you're a good sexual match from the get-go. So my suggestion to you would be to do a bit of research. Now, I know that some people can find it daunting to do that when it comes to sexual fantasies that are about power play, because sometimes delving into sort of BDSM forums like FetLife can feel like you're going a little full throttle, right? So FetLife specifically is a forum for those who identify as kinky, and it's a space that can be poorly moderated, right? It can even be unsafe for some. But it's also a space where there's a wealth of knowledge, and it can therefore be a really great way to establish your own boundaries and kind of feel into how far you want to go and how far you don't want to go. And once you know what you like and what you definitely don't like, then it will be easier to have that conversation because you'll know more about particular dynamics that already exist. So it can kind of be easier to ask about them and see if the person you're interested in likes those dynamics too. Now, in a conversation where you've then already established that there is a desire for power dynamics and playing around with them, you can name your style of submission. And you can do that either with a label, but you can also do it casually. So you can say something like, I like some back and forth. I like a little playfulness. Or you can give examples of specific things you like words you want to be used or words you don't want to be used. And then remember to ask really early, how do you like to take the lead? Or do you like it when someone resists a bit? Or do you prefer someone who follows right away, right? Are you into giving consensual pain? Or are you not into giving pain? And it's always okay when you have these conversations to keep it light at first. And text is a great place for that. So you can even frame it as a turn-on if you don't want to talk about it in that kind of negotiation type of way where you can say, I love when someone takes charge, but only after I push them a little. And chatting about specifics can really be a turn on. So you can think about this conversation not just in terms of checking your sexual compatibility, but also about it being a turn on in and of itself, right? Kind of like you were sexting before. And a lot of people in the kink community know of this, but in many heterosexual or kind of more vanilla dating contexts, these conversations don't actually happen. And that's partly because what we've all been taught is almost a sort of unspoken script for how sex is, quote unquote, supposed to go. So often it starts with kissing, and then there's some touching. Then you maybe get naked and there's oral sex, and then it ends with vaginal penetration. But if we're looking at today's study, it really did describe how relying on that kind of assumed script often leads to misunderstandings. And that the participants who use tech to talk openly about their desires and limits really did describe feeling clearer and more confident and almost better aligned with their partners. So I think, whether you're listening to this now and you are into kink or you're not, I really think that everyone could benefit from more of these upfront sexual conversations. And that's not because the script that exists is inherently wrong. Right? There's a reason it's familiar. A lot of people do like it and prefer it. But we want to have these conversations because if we don't, it can limit pleasure and creativity. And especially for women and people with vulvas, since penetration alone isn't usually the kind of sex that produces orgasms, it's especially important, right? So there's nothing wrong with that traditional hetero script of sex, but let's not assume that it's the default for everyone. Rather, take that script, tear it up, and see where it takes you. Because when you do that, you'll start to lean into what your body wants, where your mind is taking you. When you don't have a script to follow, it's much easier to find your real, true, innate desires and turn-ons. And when you have these conversations early on, it will help all partners feel more seen and more turned on, and you're going to be less likely to misread one another. In the end, I want you to know that your instinct on checking whether you're sexually compatible from the get-go is great. Far too few of us do that, so by all means, lead with that next time. Initiate the conversation if the other person doesn't, and get specific because you're allowed to and you're encouraged to. So that entails naming your wants and sharing your turn-ons. Because you're not too much for doing that. You're just making sure that you're going to actually be seen. And if someone doesn't want what you want, it doesn't mean you're doing submission wrong. It means you're just not the right match. So today, we've explored how misunderstandings around dominance and submission and sexual roles in general can create confusion, even in casual relationships that might seem lighthearted or playful. The research shows that in BDSM dynamics, early and clear communication, especially through tech, was described as key to reducing misunderstanding and improving connection. And using text or tech-based tools overall isn't about avoiding intimacy. It can actually build it because it allows for more honesty, more reflection, and often leads to better sex. It can also lead to more compatibility and fewer misread signals. But we also looked at why it's so easy to fall into unspoken expectations, especially when we're trying to keep things sexy or casual. And when people have different understandings of what dominance or submission looks like, things can fall apart before they ever get fully clarified. So here's what I want you to remember. Submission isn't one size fits all. You can be submissive and still initiate sex. You can tease and resist and enjoy a bit of push-pull. It's a well-known and celebrated role within the BDSM community. Use texting to your advantage. Especially in new or casual dynamics, tech can be a great place to start. You can express turn-ons and limits and desires in a way that feels less awkward and more exciting. But you can also use it in long-term relationships to talk about the harder, more sensitive parts regarding sex. Things like mismatched libidos or pain during sex or uncomfortability, right? Sometimes writing things out is easier than saying them out loud. Be curious early. Ask what dominance means to your partner, whether they enjoy taking control after a little resistance, or if they prefer you to be submissive from the get-go. These types of early questions can reveal a lot about compatibility. Define what you like, even if it's light. So whether you're into kind of full BDSM and you have the role that you really like to step into, or you identify as a specific role, it's important to talk about it. Because you don't need to adopt every label within the BDSM world, but the more language that you have, the easier it becomes to have these conversations, to feel seen, to get what you want, and to give your partner what they want too. Don't skip aftercare, even in casual sex. So even if it's just a text that says, "That was hot," or "Are you okay after earlier?" that kind of checking in builds trust, and it opens up for conversations about what you might want to do differently next time. And that trust is what makes future sex safer, sexier, and more emotionally grounded. Finally, talk about how to say no to sex. It can be hard to reject a partner sexually, right? We've talked about that on the podcast at length. So sometimes what ends up happening is we say vague things like, "I'm tired," or "I need to work in the morning." But if you've chatted beforehand about what those words mean, it will be easier for your partner to pick up on the subtext. But also, remember that you can always ask. So if someone says, "I have to work in the morning," asking them outright to clarify if they mean they don't want sex at all is just going to be really helpful for both of you. Thank you so much to my audience member who shared your question, and thank you for letting me answer it in this format. I really do appreciate it. Please remember that everything shared in this episode is for informational purposes only and isn't a substitute for medical advice or therapy. For personal support, please reach out to a qualified professional. If you're looking to get your desire back without pressure and stress, you want help on how to talk about sex with your partner, and you want to have more and better sex, head to leanoren.com or click on the link in the show notes to learn more about my one-to-one online program, Redesire. Thanks for listening.